What if the person everyone trusted to protect you was the last person to ever see you alive? On the last day of school before summer vacation, 17-year-old Alissa Turney smiled goodbye to her friends, expecting the summer to begin like any other. She had plans, dreams, and a future that seemed just within reach. But within hours, she would disappear without a trace. More than 2 decades later, no one has found her, no body has ever been recovered, and one question continues to haunt investigators, journalists, and millions who have followed the case. What really happened to Alissa Turney? Before we begin, if you enjoy well-researched true crime documentaries that focus on real victims and unsolved mysteries, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Every week, we explore cases that deserve to be remembered because every victim deserves to have their story told. Phoenix, Arizona was home to thousands of families looking for quiet neighborhoods and good schools. Among them lived the Turney family. Alyssa Marie Turney was born on April 3, 1984. Friends described her as kind, funny, independent, and full of life. She loved spending time with friends and was looking forward to finishing high school. Like many teenagers, she dreamed about freedom, adulthood, and making her own decisions. But behind closed doors, life inside the Turney home appeared far more complicated. Alyssa's mother had died from cancer years earlier. After her death, Alyssa continued living with her stepfather, Michael Turney, who had legally adopted her, along with her younger half-sister Sarah. Michael portrayed himself as an extremely protective father. According to him, he simply wanted to keep his daughter safe. Others saw something very different. Family members, friends, and eventually investigators described Michael as unusually controlling. He allegedly monitored nearly every aspect of Alyssa's life. He reportedly recorded telephone conversations, watched her interactions with friends, enforced strict rules, and closely tracked where she went and who she spent time with. Years later, Sarah would describe growing up in what felt like a house under constant surveillance. At the time, however, most outsiders didn't know how unusual life inside the house really was. By the spring of 2001, Alyssa was 17 years old and nearing adulthood. Friends said she often talked about moving out as soon as she turned 18. Some relatives later recalled that she wanted to spend time in California with family members during the summer. She was eager for independence. Then came Thursday, May 17, 2001. It was the last day of her junior year at Paradise Valley High School. The atmosphere at school was cheerful. Students were celebrating the start of summer break. Around lunchtime, Michael arrived to pick Alyssa up early. Several classmates remembered seeing her leave campus with him. It would be the last confirmed sighting of Alissa Turney. According to Michael, the two went to lunch together. He later told police they argued during the meal because Alyssa wanted more freedom and fewer restrictions. After returning home, he claimed she stormed into her bedroom. Michael said he later left the house to run errands and pick up Sarah. When he returned several hours later, Alyssa was gone. On her bed was a handwritten note. The note stated she had decided to run away to California. At first glance, the explanation seemed believable. 17-year-olds sometimes run away. Police accepted the story, but almost immediately details began raising uncomfortable questions. If Alyssa planned to start a new life, why had she left behind her money? Why were her clothes still in her room? Why hadn't she taken her cell phone? Why was her car still parked outside? Why did she leave behind personal belongings that almost every runaway would normally bring? Even more puzzling, the paycheck she was expecting from work was never collected. Her bank account remained untouched. Nothing suggested someone preparing for a permanent disappearance. Despite those inconsistencies, investigators initially classified the case as a runaway. The first crucial hours slipped away. Search efforts were limited. Potential evidence disappeared with time. Days later, Michael claimed something extraordinary happened. He said Alyssa called him from a payphone in Riverside, California. According to him, the conversation lasted only seconds before the line disconnected. He even drove hundreds of miles to California searching for her after tracing the call to a convenience store payphone. Yet no one ever confirmed seeing Alyssa there. No surveillance footage placed her at the location. No witness remembered speaking with her. The phone call only deepened the mystery. As weeks became months, hope slowly faded. Birthdays passed. Christmases came and went. Friends graduated from high school. Life continued for everyone else. But Alyssa never contacted a single friend. She never used her social security number. She never opened a new bank account. She never renewed identification. She simply vanished. For years, many believed she had chosen to disappear. Others were never convinced. Among those who struggled with the official explanation were several of Alyssa's relatives and friends, who questioned whether she would truly abandon everyone she cared about without ever reaching out again. Still, without physical evidence, there was little investigators believed they could do. The case sat largely dormant. Then, years later, an unexpected confession from a convicted killer would reopen the investigation, and what detectives uncovered next would completely change the direction of the case. For years, Alissa Turney's disappearance remained little more than a cold case tucked away in filing cabinets. Detectives had very few leads, no confirmed sightings, and no physical evidence pointing to what had happened after she walked out of Paradise Valley High School with Michael Turney on May 17, 2001. Then, in 2008, everything changed. Hundreds of miles away, authorities interviewed a convicted serial killer named Edward Harold Bell. Bell claimed responsibility for numerous murders of young women across several states. During interviews, he alleged that one of his victims was Alissa Turney. For investigators desperate for answers, it was impossible to ignore. Bell claimed he had kidnapped and murdered Alyssa in Arizona. At first glance, it sounded like the breakthrough detectives had been waiting for, but as they investigated his claims, problems quickly emerged. Bell couldn't provide details that only the killer would know. Many of his statements conflicted with the known facts of Alyssa's disappearance. Investigators began to suspect he was simply inserting himself into a high-profile missing persons case. His confession ultimately fell apart. Although Bell was ruled out as a credible suspect, his claims accomplished something unexpected. They forced detectives to reopen Alyssa's file. When investigators began reviewing the original case with fresh eyes, they noticed something that should have been questioned years earlier. Almost every significant piece of information about Alyssa's final day had come from one person, Michael Turney. Detectives started interviewing family members again, friends, former classmates, former co-workers, people who had known the family. And a troubling pattern began to emerge. Many described Michael as obsessively controlling. Several recalled that Alyssa often complained about his strict rules. According to later court testimony and interviews, Michael monitored nearly every aspect of life inside the home. He installed cameras, recorded conversations, and maintained extensive surveillance systems. Detectives eventually recovered thousands of hours of recordings and documents from his house. Prosecutors later argued that this behavior reflected an unhealthy obsession with control, though the defense disputed those interpretations. Then investigators made another disturbing discovery. Michael had written an enormous collection of journals and notes. Some contained detailed observations about neighbors. Others discussed government conspiracies. He believed organized crime and labor unions were targeting him. Over time, detectives found themselves sorting through boxes upon boxes of handwritten material. But perhaps the most alarming discovery came in 2008. Federal agents searched Michael Turney's home after learning he possessed dozens of homemade explosive devices. Inside the residence, investigators recovered approximately 26 pipe bombs, along with gasoline containers and other materials. Authorities also found writings describing elaborate plans involving a local union that Michael believed was conspiring against him. He was federally prosecuted for possessing the unregistered destructive devices and later served time in prison on that conviction. The discovery shocked investigators. Although the explosives case wasn't directly connected to Alyssa's disappearance, it fundamentally changed how authorities viewed Michael. This wasn't simply an overprotective father. This was someone who had demonstrated dangerous and unpredictable behavior. As detectives continued reviewing the evidence, one item drew particular attention. The note Michael claimed Alyssa had left behind before disappearing. Investigators questioned whether it had actually been written voluntarily. There was never definitive forensic proof establishing exactly how or under what circumstances the note was created. Its authenticity became one of several issues prosecutors later highlighted as they built their case. Detectives also revisited Michael's claim that Alyssa had called him from California. Again, there was no independent evidence proving Alyssa herself made the call. No witness placed her at the payphone. No surveillance footage existed. The entire account depended on Michael's version of events. Meanwhile, Alyssa's younger half-sister, Sarah Turney, was growing older. For years, Sarah had believed her father's explanation. She believed Alyssa had run away. She defended him publicly. Whenever people questioned Michael, Sarah argued they were unfairly accusing an innocent man. But as she became an adult, her perspective slowly changed. She began examining the evidence herself, reading police documents, watching interviews, speaking with investigators. As more information surfaced, Sarah found herself confronting painful questions she had never allowed herself to ask. Why had Alyssa never contacted anyone she loved? Why had every major detail originated with Michael? Why were so many people describing the same disturbing behavior inside their home? The more Sarah learned, the harder it became to believe the runaway story. Eventually, she reached a heartbreaking conclusion. She no longer believed her sister had left voluntarily. Instead, Sarah became one of the strongest advocates for reopening the investigation. She began speaking publicly, she appeared in documentaries, she gave interviews, and eventually she launched a podcast dedicated to finding answers and keeping Alyssa's name alive. Her campaign reached millions of people online. What had once been an almost forgotten cold case suddenly became one of America's most widely discussed missing person investigations. Public pressure mounted. Investigators continued rebuilding the case piece by piece. Although they still had no body, prosecutors believed circumstantial evidence could be enough. Nearly 20 years after Alyssa disappeared, they made a decision few thought possible. In August 2020, a grand jury indicted Michael Turney on a charge of second-degree murder in connection with Alyssa's disappearance. He pleaded not guilty, and the case proceeded toward trial. For Sarah, the indictment represented something she had spent years fighting for. It wasn't a conviction, but it meant the legal system was finally prepared to hear the evidence. After nearly 2 decades, Michael Turney would have to answer the question investigators had been asking since 2001, what happened to Alyssa? The trial that followed would become one of the most closely watched no-body murder cases in Arizona, and its outcome would leave many people stunned. For nearly 20 years, one question had remained unanswered. What happened to Alissa Turney? There was no body, no crime scene, no eyewitness who claimed to have seen a murder, yet prosecutors believed they had assembled enough circumstantial evidence to convince a jury that Alyssa had not run away, and that the last person to see her alive, Michael Turney, was responsible for her death. The trial finally began in 2023. It was one of Arizona's most closely watched no-body murder cases. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors carefully reconstructed the final day of Alyssa's life. They argued that the evidence painted a picture far different from the one Michael had told police in 2001. According to the prosecution, Alyssa had been preparing for adulthood, not planning to disappear forever. She was close to finishing high school, maintained friendships, held a job, and looked forward to the future. Prosecutors emphasized that after May 17, 2001, there was no verified activity under her name, no bank transactions, no employment, no government records, and no confirmed contact with friends or relatives. They argued this was inconsistent with the behavior of someone who had simply chosen to start a new life. The prosecution also highlighted Michael's increasingly controlling behavior. Jurors heard testimony describing how he monitored Alyssa's daily life, recorded conversations inside the home, and exercised an extraordinary level of control over the household. Detectives testified about the extensive surveillance materials they recovered during later searches of his home. Prosecutors argued that Michael had both the opportunity and the motive. They suggested that as Alyssa approached adulthood and sought greater independence, tensions inside the home escalated. The defense, however, presented a very different narrative. Michael Turney maintained his innocence. His attorneys argued that investigators had spent years focusing on him while failing to pursue other possible explanations. They reminded jurors that no physical evidence connected Michael to a homicide. There was no body, no murder weapon, no forensic evidence proving Alyssa had died inside the home or anywhere else. The defense also challenged the reliability of testimony about Michael's personality, arguing that being eccentric or controlling did not prove murder. Throughout the proceedings, one person drew particular attention: Sarah Turney. Years earlier, Sarah had defended her father publicly. Now she took the witness stand against him. It was a heartbreaking moment. She testified about growing up in the Turney household, about the surveillance, the strict rules, and why she had ultimately come to believe that her sister never ran away. Watching Sarah testify against the man who had raised her became one of the trial's most emotional moments. It also underscored the unimaginable position she had found herself in. She wasn't seeking revenge. She repeatedly said she was seeking answers. As the trial continued, prosecutors acknowledged the challenges of proving a murder without a body. They asked jurors to consider the totality of the evidence rather than any single piece. The defense urged jurors not to fill gaps with assumptions. After deliberating, the jury reached its decision. In July 2023, Michael Turney was found not guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict did not declare that Alyssa had run away. It did not determine what happened to her. It meant only that the prosecution had not proven Michael's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the high standard required in criminal cases. For Sarah Turney, the verdict was devastating. After years of advocacy, countless interviews, a podcast, and relentless efforts to bring attention to her sister's disappearance, the criminal case had ended without a conviction. Still, Sarah has continued to speak publicly about Alyssa, emphasizing that the acquittal does not answer the central mystery, where Alyssa is and what happened to her. More than 2 decades after she vanished, Alissa Turney has never been found. Her remains have never been recovered. No one has been held criminally responsible for her disappearance. The case remains one of Arizona's most haunting missing person mysteries. Over the years, it has been featured in documentaries, podcasts, television programs, and investigative reporting. Each new audience learns about the smiling 17-year-old who left school on the last day before summer break and was never seen again. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this story isn't just the mystery itself, it's the determination of one sister. Sarah Turney could have accepted the original explanation. She could have stayed silent. Instead, she chose to question the narrative she had believed for years. She educated herself. She spoke to investigators. She risked criticism. She testified in court. And she transformed her grief into advocacy. Whether or not anyone is ever held legally responsible, Sarah ensured that Alyssa's name would not disappear. Cases like this remind us that justice and truth are not always the same thing. A criminal court can decide there isn't enough evidence to convict. That doesn't necessarily answer what happened. Some mysteries remain unresolved, not because people stop searching, but because the evidence needed to prove the truth never emerges. For Alyssa's friends and family, the hope remains that one day someone will come forward with information that finally explains what happened after she left Paradise Valley High School on May 17, 2001. Someone, somewhere, may know the missing piece. Until that day comes, Alissa Turney remains missing. She was only 17 years old. Her story continues to remind us why every missing person's case deserves attention, persistence, and compassion. If you have any information related to Alissa Turney's disappearance, investigators encourage you to contact the appropriate law enforcement agency or silent witness. Even the smallest detail could help bring answers to a family that has waited more than 2 decades. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime documentaries. Sharing these cases helps keep victims' names alive and can sometimes generate the tip that changes everything. Because while time may pass, no one should ever be forgotten.